One of the most important events in English history is the English Civil War, which was fought from 1642 to 1649. That war would be a battle between absolutism and constitutionalism. Who would be supreme in England, the monarch or Parliament? So today we're going to kind of look at that struggle and how it unfolded. A couple things before we get started. If you really like studying modern England, I would suggest getting this book. It's Early Modern England, 1485 to 1714. It's by Robert Buckholtz and Newton Key, and it basically covers the period of the Tudors and the Stuarts. It's a great book, so I would get that if you like English history. Another thing is I made some guided notes. These are just called the English Civil War guided notes. If you want, it's just 2 pages. It kind of has a timeline. You can just print this off and take notes as we go through this lecture if you want to. You don't have to by any means. Okay, so if you look at slide 2, I kind of got a timeline up there. We'll kind of go through those events today. There's really 5 issues in the English Civil War. The issue of sovereignty, finance, foreign policy, religion, local control, and the personality of the king. So as we kind of talk about the events in the Civil War, you might kind of look for how these issues play out. If you look at slide 4, I've got a map of England and Ireland and Scotland, just kind of showing you the religious situation. Basically in England, Anglicans and Puritans, those are the Protestants, they're kind of the majority, the Catholics are the minority. Scotland, the Presbyterians, they're Protestants, they're the majority, and Catholics are the minority. In Ireland is the only place you have a Catholic majority, and these religious divides are kind of going to play into the Civil War. Now, the Tudors had ruled previously. When Queen Elizabeth dies, she passes the crown on to James I. So James, Charles I, Charles II, James II, these are the Stuarts, and they're going to be who the Civil War is fought against. Queen Elizabeth was a powerful monarch. We kind of covered her. She never married, so she leaves the throne to James V of Scotland, who becomes James I of England. James VI of Scotland. Now, he's a tolerant, intelligent, educated king. He's not warlike. He kind of labeled himself Rex Pacificus, which means the peaceful king. He negotiated the Treaty of London that ended the war with Spain that Elizabeth was fighting. He's a strong believer in divine rights of kings. Here's a quote from one of his speeches. He says, "The state of monarchy is the supremest thing upon earth, for kings are not only God's lieutenants upon earth and sit upon God's throne, but even by God himself they are called gods. That is, to dispute what God may do is blasphemy. So it is sedition in subjects to dispute what a king may do in the height of his power. I will not be content that my power be disputed upon, but I shall ever be willing to make the reason appear of all my doings, and rule my actions according to my laws. Do not meddle with the main points of government. That is my craft. I am now an old king. I must not be taught my office." So this divine right of kings, the Stuart dynasty really believes in that. Now, James I is often seen as an outsider. He's from Scotland. When he came to England from Scotland, he brought a bunch of courtiers with him. They get nicknamed the Hungry Scots because they're always eating up the money of England. He spends a lot of money on buildings, on masks. These are kind of parties, and his favorite courtiers. You can kind of see on slide 10 that the debt that England incurred really shot up under James I. And James I made a comment that ruling Scotland and then going to England was like being in the wilderness for 40 years, a wilderness of barren soil, and then you make it to the promised land, England, because it seems really rich compared to Scotland. James I often clashed with Parliament. During the 30 Years' War, you have Protestants versus Catholic. James kind of wants to stay out of the conflict. Remember, he's the Rex Pacificus. But Parliament is Protestant. They want to get involved and help the Protestants of Europe. James I wants money from Parliament, but every time he asks Parliament for money, Parliament comes and says, okay, we'll give you money, but we're going to kind of tell you how to run the kingdom. So James I often dismisses Parliament, sends them home when they clash with him. There's also a lot of religious disputes. A lot of people are not satisfied with the Church of England. It still seems too Catholic for a lot of Puritans. The Puritans want less power for the bishops. They want less ceremony, less formal dress. They don't like sports or drinking or dancing or other forms of entertainment on Sunday. They want anti-Catholic laws enforced. James I was a pretty tolerant guy, so he doesn't want to enforce these anti-Catholic laws. He does have something called the Hampton Court Conference in 1604 where he meets with these Puritan leaders. He agrees to some moderate reforms, and he says, we'll translate the Bible into English, a new translation. Remember, Puritans like it when the Bible's in everyone's own language. But no matter what, there's always going to be religious disputes. There's a famous attempt to blow up Parliament in November of 1605. This is the famous gunpowder plot. Back then, you could rent the basement of Parliament for like a party or like a meeting. So some Catholics rent this, and they plan to blow up Parliament. Guy Fawkes is the guy that kind of gets captured, and this basically results in restrictions on Catholics. Guy Fawkes gets found guilty of treason. He gets drawn and quartered. It's pretty bad punishment. James I dies, and his son Charles I takes over. He also believes in the divine right of kings, and he carries himself much better than his father did as far as he looks more kingly. James I kind of looked awkward. His face was kind of odd. He had a Scottish accent. He had a lisp. So he didn't seem very kingly, but Charles I seems very, very much like a king. You can see from some of the pictures painted of him, he looks like he knows what he's doing as far as being a king. He also clashes with Parliament. Sometimes when Parliament won't give him money, he'll require nobles to forcibly loan him money. Parliament did offer to vote him money if he agreed to their petition of right. If you look at slide 17, you can see what some of these rights are. No man should be forced to pay a tax not voted by Parliament. You can't be imprisoned without being charged. You should not be forced to house soldiers and sailors. No civilian could be subject to martial law. Charles I, like I said, dismisses Parliament a lot. In 1629, he asks Parliament to meet. He needs money, but they don't give him money because he won't acquiesce to their demands. There's a famous incident called the Sir John Eliot resolutions. In Parliament, when the Speaker of the House stands up, you're supposed to cut off debate. Well, some of the opponents of the king were trying to get these resolutions passed, and as soon as the Speaker stood up, they had to stop talking. So there's a guy, Sir John Eliot, giving a speech basically talking about all the way the king is violating liberty, the liberties of Englishmen, and the speaker starts to stand up to cut him off from talking, and people rush him and hold the speaker down and forcibly keep him down until Sir John Eliot is done talking. Charles I sends Parliament home. They don't meet for 11 years, so from 1629 to 1640, there's no Parliament. This is often called the time of Charles I's self-rule, meaning he's personally ruling England. He raises taxes, he raises customs rates, he looks for old medieval statues to basically revive old fees. There's something that is called ship money. Back in medieval times, if you were a town close to the coast, you had to pay a special tax to pay for the navy to protect you. Well, Charles I makes every town in England pay this tax, even if you're in the middle of the country, you're landlocked, there's no way you'll get attacked by an enemy navy. He still makes you pay this tax. Englishmen resist. Some nobles refuse to pay the ship money, and over time, a lot of people refuse to pay it. There's also religious issues with Charles I. There was a guy named Jacob Arminius. He was a Protestant, but he basically seemed kind of Catholic. He taught that there's free will. He said there is a role for good works to play in salvation. Ritual is good. Religious hierarchy is important. Parliament actually condemned Jacob Arminius and his followers, but Charles appoints William Laud as Archbishop of Canterbury in 1633, and he was a follower of Jacob Arminius. So basically, Charles is going against Parliament. William Laud increased inspections of churches to make sure they were following the Anglican model. He enforced rituals on Puritans who don't want to do that. He enforced censorship. He persecuted Puritans. There's a group of famous Puritans, William Prynne, John Beestwick, and Henry Burton. They get their ears notched because they print pamphlets that are anti-William Laud and anti-Charles I. Other religious issues, Charles I marries a Catholic, Henrietta Maria of France. So she's French and Catholic. They're in love. They produce 6 children in their marriage. That's a lot of future heirs. What if they turn out to be Catholic? Englishmen don't want to be ruled by Catholics, most of them. And another thing to keep in mind, the 30 Years' War is going on the continent. So basically, Catholics are winning early on. So if you're a Protestant in England, you're fearful that if the Catholics win on the continent, the Catholics might win in England. There's a pamphlet that makes its way to England during the 30 Years' War. I'll read it for you. It says, I had a book come to my hand of the miserable state of Germany, whereas in a glass you might see the mournful fate of our sister nation, now drunk with misery. They were tied about their heads with cords till the blood came out of their eyes. They have hung some up in the smoke, drying them with fires. Burning matches were put to their tongues and breasts. Those parts that nature hideth they filled with gunpowder, and giving fire to it they have in a horrible manner burst their bellies and killed them. So basically this is a pamphlet talking about how Catholics are treating Protestants in Germany, and Englishmen are worried that this is going to happen in England. In 1637, Charles I tries to force Scotland to change their religious church, their religious makeup. The Scots revolt. There's a series of wars, the First and Second Bishop Wars. Charles needs money to fight these rebellions in Scotland, so he asks Parliament to meet to give him money. Guess what? Parliament meets in 1640. Charles dismisses them. This is called the Short Parliament. Now he gets in a tough spot and he has to call them back later that year. And this time they won't leave. So from 1640 to 1660, Parliament meets, and this is called the Long Parliament. Basically, this Long Parliament is anti-Charles I, so they clash a lot. They pass the Triennial Act, which says Parliament must meet every 3 years. They impeach and execute William Laud, so we might not be able to touch the king, but we'll execute his religious lieutenant. In 1641, there's a rebellion in Ireland. So basically, Scotland is in rebellion, Ireland is in rebellion. It's not a good situation. Parliament is dominated by this guy named John Pym. He puts forth all these resolutions that can be seen as anti-monarch, anti-Charles I. Parliament passes a militia bill which says Parliament will name the commander of the militia, not the king. So basically, Parliament is taking control of the military, and Charles I doesn't like this, so he tries to arrest the leaders of Parliament, John Pym and the other radicals. So on January 4th, 1642, he enters the House of Commons to arrest them. They flee, and civil war breaks out. So basically, the Civil War is Charles I versus Parliament. Those who support the king are called Cavaliers. Those who support Parliament are called Roundheads. Charles I puts his nephew in charge of his royalist army. His nephew was Prince Rupert of the Rhine. He's a veteran of the 30 Years' War. The royalists win the first major battle, the Battle of Edge Hill in October 1642. Basically, Charles I and Henrietta flee to the north. Parliament holds the south of England. There's a lot of atrocities on each side. There's a lot of fighting. The most famous military leader of Parliament's side is Oliver Cromwell. He's a devout Puritan. He had a lot of internal struggles about his salvation, similar to Martin Luther. He's not against monarchy. He just wants the king to respect the rights of Englishmen. He leads a regiment in the Parliamentarian Army. He's a cavalry commander. He picks officers based on their merit, not their birth. At the Battle of Marston Moor in July 1644, Cromwell defeats the Royalist army. It's the bloodiest battle of the war. Cromwell said, God made them as stubble to our sword. So big victory. Cromwell creates something called the New Model Army. Early on, it's mostly militias fighting against the Royalist army. The Royalists are very professional. So the parliamentarians create a new army that's professional as well. The decisive battle is the Battle of Naseby in June 1645. Now, Charles surrenders partway through the Civil War, but he later escapes. So the fighting stops halfway through the Civil War. So sometimes historians break it into the First English Civil War and the Second English Civil War. He negotiates with Parliament, with the army, with Scotland, but basically Charles I is playing off all his enemies. Just because there's two sides doesn't mean it's not more intricate. Parliament has a lot of internal squabbles amongst themselves. They don't always get along, so Charles thinks he can kind of play them off against each other and get back his victories or get back his power. One of the examples of this problem with the Parliament side is Parliament doesn't pay the army, and the army forms something called the Council of the Army. You basically have two groups, the Grandees and the Levelers. Both groups want paid, but the Grandees are more the gentlemen. They don't want much to change socially. The Levelers, they really want things to change. They want popular sovereignty. They want suffrage for all men. They want land ownership, religious toleration, equality before the law. These two groups have a debate in 1647. It's called the Putney Debates. They basically discuss what rights Englishmen should have. Cromwell's kind of on the fence. He's not a big fan of democracy. Usually the Levelers are seen as more favorable to democracy. Eventually what happens is the army gets rid of anybody in Parliament who is not radical enough. So this is called Pride's Purge. Basically, the army blocks the entrance to Parliament, and the only people inside Parliament are the one that want to punish the king. At first, nobody wants to punish the king or kill him. It was just a civil war. It was fought to show that Parliament is supreme. Once the king is defeated, let's just let him live. He can acknowledge that we're supreme, meaning Parliament. Well, once Charles I tried to restart the Civil War, then a lot of people realized maybe we have to get rid of the king. And this new Parliament is called the Rump Parliament, the one that was purged so that only radical members exist. Now, King Charles I is put on trial. He does not personally recognize the legality of the trial. He says this is all a sham. He gets sentenced to death by 59 judges. Cromwell famously said, "I will cut off his head with the crown on it." And King Charles I is executed in January of 1649. He gives a speech right before he dies and talks about how he was protecting rights. Let me read you a little part. He said, "I must tell you that the liberty and freedom of the people consists in having of government those laws by which their life and their goods may be most their own. It is not for having a share in government. That is nothing pertaining to them. A subject and a sovereign are clean different things. If I would have given away to arbitrary way, for to have all laws changed according to that, I am a martyr of the people." So basically he says, you have your place as subject, I have my place as king. He's executed. Supposedly, Cromwell said that this was a cruel necessity. I didn't want to have to execute the king, but I did. From 1649 to 1660, England is going to be a republic. This era has different names. Some people call it the Commonwealth. Some people call it the Interregnum, which is just Latin for between kings. Some people call it the Protectorate. There's a lot of new religious groups that pop up. There's Baptists, there's Seekers, there's Diggers, there's Ranters, there's Quakers, there's Fifth Monarchy men. Basically, a lot of new Protestant groups. And it's generally seen as a time of toleration. That's why you have so many new groups. You have more acceptance and less censorship. But what ends up happening is Cromwell ends up taking control. The Rump Parliament is seen as too radical by conservatives, as too conservative by radicals. They send the army to Ireland and Scotland. Cromwell fights in both those places. Later on, the Rump Parliament gets dissolved by Cromwell. Something called the Parliament of Saints pops up. Basically, all the Parliament, or Cromwell asks all the church leaders from throughout England to come and form a new Parliament of Saints. Basically, the idea is we're churchmen, so we'll be above politics. It doesn't go well, and it gets dissolved by Cromwell. In 1653, Cromwell is presented with the instrument of government. This is when they start calling England ruled by the Protectorate. Cromwell is the Protectorate. Um, he basically divides England up into military districts, and this is when the intoleration of the Protectorate kicks in. There's a standing army. They crack down on dissent and liberties. They crack down on some things like drunkenness and mistreatment of women, which is good to crack down on. But they also crack down on things like the theater, sports, celebrations, holidays. A lot of people don't like this. Cromwell was offered the crown to be King of England, but he refused it in 1658. He dies later that year. His son takes over, Richard Cromwell, but he only lasts a couple of years. The army ends up deposing him. And what ends up happening is England asks Charles II, the son of the executed king, to come back and rule. Now, Charles II had been living in exile in France. Basically, the whole family had been. So now Charles I comes back as king. So this is called the Restoration. In 1660, you have the Restoration. Charles II is pretty lenient. He doesn't come back and kill everybody who had something to do with his father's death. He does have Cromwell's body dug up. He hangs his remains like a criminal and puts his head on a pike outside the city. Other people who signed the death warrant for the king, they're sentenced to be hanged, drawn, and quartered. Their remains are boiled and impaled on the gates of London. So he does get a little bit of revenge, but it's not like thousands of people die. It's only a few dozen, possibly. Now, Charles II he's very well educated. He's witty. He's approachable. He's tolerant and flexible. He's a big patron of the arts, but he's also distrustful of others. He has a lot of mistresses. He's an absolutist. Now, he reserves some powers for himself. You know, he can make peace and war. He can call or prorogue or dismiss Parliament. He can name government officials. He can call out the militia. But the Parliament also limits these powers. So we still don't know who's supreme in England, the monarchy or Parliament. Every time there's an election, Parliament gets kind of a nickname. In 1661, the Cavalier Parliament is elected. They're dominated by Anglican royalists. They see Catholics and Puritans as dangerous. They pass a series of laws called the Clarendon Code. These are basically crackdowns on Puritans, on Quakers, on Baptists. So basically, this is a time of intolerance for groups who are dissenters. They passed the Test Act in 1673 that says if you're a Puritan or a Catholic or some religious group other than Anglican, you don't have the right to vote, to preach, to assemble. You can't hold office. You can't attend or teach at a university. Now, Charles doesn't enforce the Test Act. He pushes for toleration for Catholics and dissenters. He has a Portuguese wife who's Catholic, Catherine of Braganza. James II, his brother, is openly Catholic. Charles II isn't Catholic, but his brother and his wife are. He fights wars against the Dutch on the side of France. The Dutch Republic is a Protestant nation. France is Catholic. So if you're a Protestant in England, you feel like Charles II is always siding with Catholics. And Charles does sign a secret treaty with Louis XIV called the Treaty of Dover. Basically, he allies himself with France. Charles says he will get money from Louis XIV, and in return, he will try to take England back towards Catholicism. So there is this secret movement to make England Catholic again. There's fears that Catholics are going to assassinate Protestant leaders. So there's basically a lot of fears in England. Charles II dissolves Parliament in 1676. Then you have a series of elections called the exclusion elections. Basically, anti-monarch politicians win office. So you get the creation of these two political parties that are going to be with England the rest of their history pretty much. You got the Whigs and the Tories. The Whigs are on the side of Parliament, the people. They don't want Catholicism. The Tories are more of a monarchy, a royalist political party. Eventually, the exclusion parliaments are very Whig dominated, but politics is a pendulum. It always swings back and forth. And eventually, when Charles II dies, he converts to Catholicism on his deathbed. After he converts, his brother James II becomes king. James II is Catholic. He's openly Catholic. He's a military man. He's popular at first, but later on he loses his popularity. He appoints Catholics to the military. He appoints them to the university and government jobs. He attempts to give equality to Catholics. When Louis XIV revokes the Edict of Nantes in 1685, James II later suspends the Clarendon Code, so all those laws against dissenters. And in 1688, him and his wife, they have a son, James III. So now they have a Catholic son who is going to be the next King of England when James II dies. So this really worries Protestants. And what you have is a group called the Immortal Seven. They invite the rulers of the Dutch Republic, William and Mary, who are Protestant. They write them a letter and say, will you invade England and save us from our future Catholic king? So William of Orange invades England in November of 1688. He's trying to protect his wife's claim to the throne. And earlier, Parliament had said Mary of the Dutch Republic is going to be the next heir to the English throne, and her husband. He wants to stop England from becoming Catholic, and he wants to stop Louis XIV from dominating Europe. William of Orange and the Dutch Republic had been fighting the French, so they don't want England to fall to the French. Now, when William of Orange lands to fight James II, James II is getting ready to do battle, but he gets a slow start. He's indecisive. A lot of his supporters start to flee and take William's side. Nobles go over to William. James II's sons-in-law leave him. His main military commanders leave him. Even his other daughter, Anne, leaves him. And basically, James II flees. He's captured, put under house arrest, but then he escapes to France. So what you have is something called the Glorious Revolution. The king, James II, is deposed with little bloodshed. The first time you got rid of Charles I, lots of bloodshed. Something like 180,000 people died. I think it was like 3% of England's population. Now you only have a few people dying. William and Mary are crowned monarchs of England, but they have limits placed on them. Parliament basically says, you're going to be our king and queen, but we're going to be supreme. So they pass something called the English Bill of Rights, and William has to acknowledge that these are an Englishman's rights. It basically says no English king can tax without Parliament's permission. You can't abuse the law if you're a king. You can't manipulate judges. You can't keep a standing army. They passed the Act of Toleration in 1689, offering toleration to dissenters. They passed the Act of Settlement in 1701. That bans any Catholic from being the future King of England. This is seen as a political, not a social revolution. The men who had invited William over, they're the ones who write the English Bill of Rights, and you're going to read that so you kind of get familiar with it. The Glorious Revolution is kind of seen as a break with the medieval past. You know, in the Middle Ages, you had the divine rights of kings, you had absolutism. Now, in the modern era, you know, the time we're talking about, Parliament is supreme, constitutionalism is supreme, and England is going to become the dominant power in the 18th century. So in the 1600s, France is the dominant power, but as the 1700s progress, England becomes the dominant power through a series of wars, and also because they have a constitutionalist government. So we'll look at some of these wars later on. And if you think about it, if you look at the last slide, the one with the timeline, Leviathan, Thomas Hobbes' great work at Absolutism, it's written in 1651. That was kind of the time of the English Civil War. And you can understand that was a crazy period. You know, Englishmen are killing Englishmen, the king is being killed. Basically, Hobbes thinks you need a strong monarch to stop all this violence. But John Locke is writing during the Glorious Revolution. That was a bloodless kind of coup where the king was overthrown and Englishmen reestablished their rights, established that Parliament is supreme. So he said, you know, you can overthrow your government if they're acting corruptly, and the Glorious Revolution worked. They did. Okay, so that's the English Civil War. I'll see you next time.